Director of the Usuli Institute, and I wanted to welcome everyone. If this is the first time that you've been with us, just to say a couple of words about the Usuli Institute. We are actually a relatively new Islamic think tank. Our goal is really to raise the bar when it comes to Islamic knowledge and discussions about Islam and what the moral and ethical message of the tradition have to say about our current world and the context that we live in. And so part of what we're excited to do is bring together really smart people to have smart conversations, and that's why we're extremely excited about the event for today. I think this is a very unique conversation because it's not often that we have people who are working on the front lines in conversation with people who are working from the perspective of research and analysis and critique. And so it's a really valuable conversation. We really, value the idea of asking difficult questions in a safe environment where we can really explore intellectual ideas and hopefully try and elevate issues and understanding. So I wanted to welcome, we have two very distinguished guests today. We have Salam al-Marayati, who is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And we also have Professor Khaled Beydoun, who is the associate professor from the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, and he has a book also coming out on American Islamophobia. So we're really excited to talk about, and this is going to be moderated, of course, by Professor Khaled Beydoun. So without any further ado, we'll probably go for about an hour of conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And if people on Facebook Live have questions, please send them through Facebook, and we'll go from there. So welcome, and thank you very much.
Okay, so I have the way that this has emerged is that these are two people that I know quite well. I've known Salam for decades, 40 years. Life passes. We're old. When I first met Salam, we were young people, young and
bombastic.
Bombastic. That's a good word. That's a good way to put it. Now life has gone by. And Khaled Beydoun was at one time my student in Islamic law at UCLA. Was not 40 years ago, but
15 years ago.
15 years ago. Of course, now he has become a distinguished academic in his own right. And I know that a lot of faculty at UCLA are very proud of him. And they celebrate every time he comes to LA. But because Khaled Beydoun was he's giving a lecture at UCLA on Monday, I thought it was a real opportunity to have a frank discussion about some of what I consider the most pressing issues that confront Muslims in the United States, if not in the West. The realities we have is that we have a nativist, racist movement that we label Islamophobia, and it is a multi-layered phenomena, a historically embedded phenomena that racializes and excludes Muslims at the same time, in addition to part of this process of exclusion and racialization is stereotyping Muslims in systematic ways. But the rise of Islamophobia also raises a variety of questions as to our role as members of society and our role as representatives of the moral tradition, our role as spokespeople for that moral tradition, and the terms of engagement and terms of discourse that that always confront us And Khaled Beydoun and Salam come from very different perspectives, but they're perspectives that must be in conversation, and must be in conversation because otherwise the our Muslim community remains fractured and remains working in its own little zones of competence without a coherent, or at least an attempt at a coherent integration and coherent understanding. The questions that I have, and I'm going to go in a certain order. I mean, I'm not going to jump to policy issues like safe spaces and counter extremism, governmental policies right away. I want to start with some of the foundational questions first.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the questions that interest me is our relation to power and what we should do about power. Power has its own dynamics and its own prejudices and its own processes, and we always struggle. I mean, I always struggle with this element of how do you negotiate this power, and to what extent do you attempt to work with it? To what extent do you attempt to oppose it? What happens if you oppose power? And all in the context of our obligation to convey a moral message, because ultimately our role as community representatives is far less interesting to me than our role as representative of a moral trajectory and a moral message. In a nutshell, Islam, regardless of how we understand this moral tradition, but we're not simply, and one of the questions that I would like to deal with is Islamophobia racializes Muslims, but to what extent Muslims ought to, what should our attitude be towards this racialization? Do we embrace our identity in ethnic terms, or do we resist it and attempt to counter it and insist that we are not a racial group, but perhaps an ideological group, a group with a moral narrative? These are the type of questions that I hope to vet out. And
well, yeah, I think there, just to start off, because that question alone deserves a whole conference in terms of dealing with power or negotiating with power and the racialization of Muslims. On the one hand, the problem in a nutshell is white supremacy and white nationalism that has been a part of this country. But on the other hand, many people espouse pluralism, diversity, equality under the law. And so our approach at MPAC is we work in coalition with anyone that espouses the values that are very much in line with Islam. And we together in those coalitions fight back against Islamophobia, racism, bigotry. And it is about coalition building. I, for one, based on my understanding of Islam and based on my understanding of Islamic history, I am not interested in power. I'm interested in developing a line of Muslims that can engage in every sector of society. So if there are Muslims who want to engage with law enforcement, have them do that. If there are Muslims who want to engage with civil rights groups, have them do that. And therefore our effectiveness is the ability to leverage all the different avenues and channels that these Muslims are engaged in, and that they themselves will go up the ranks based on their performance. So it's not about, to me, it's not about negotiating with power. As you know, one of our great scholars, Imam Ja'far, said when he was given even the opportunity for power, he said, I don't want it, I side with the people. So anybody working for Islam has to be working for the community and for the people, and is pushing back against the policies that are detrimental, not only to Muslims, but to all of society. Islamophobia is actually the barometer within which this country is suffering from racism and bigotry. And whether we succeed in defeating that or not, a lot of it has to do with how much we engage the rest of society in an effective way. And as you alluded to, how we can build a cohesive front. And I agree with you that right now there's more, I wouldn't say infighting, but a lot of sideswipes, a lot of slapping around, a lot of, oh yeah, you know, they're doing this, that's stupid, or they're doing that, that's naive, or they're doing that, that's selling out, and so on and so forth. That should not be the language of leadership. Leadership is about bringing people together. And as the Quran says, "Udu ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idati al hasana wajadilhum billati hi ahsan." So we invite people to the way of our Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching. When I see trash talking, I think that goes against our Islamic character and Islamic taste. And argue with them to something that, in a way that you come up with something better. So it's not just pointing out what's bad, but work with whomever you can to come up with something that is good out of bad situations.
If I can respond in four points I want to make. First, I think the fundamental question, number one, is how does power view you as a group, and specifically a marginalized minority group? That's a fundamental question any group has to address before they negotiate what relationship with power they're going to have. Second, we need a specific framework and understanding of what Islamophobia actually is. People use the word, use the term freely, but what does it actually mean? Third, issue of racialization. How a specific group is racialized is addressed with how we define and specifically address the framework for Islamophobia. Fourth, I want to address the issue of rhetoric, language, sideswiping, and so on, which I think is fundamentally a cover for not addressing specific questions and the practical consequences of those decisions you make. I'm less concerned with what people say. What is the effect of the decisions you're making as an organization? That is more fundamental. That is a bigger priority. So the first point is this. When we talk about how power views and effectively characterizes Muslim identity, it's not novel to understand that Islamophobia is rooted in Orientalism, right? The idea that Islam has been long demonized as the civilizational foil, as the epistemological nemesis of the West, right? So Islamophobia effectively just redeploys these long entrenched Orientalist tropes that have existed for centuries, right? Letty Volk talks about this in her piece, The Citizen and the Terrorist. Islamophobia is not new. It's effectively just a modern revitalization of Orientalism. So when we view our negotiation with how we're going to relate to power, the government is launching the war on terror based on this presumption that Muslim identity is tied to terrorism. So if that is a fundamental, foundational idea that power has in the way it classifies and frames you, that should have a material impact and influence on what your relationship with power is. Right? That's the first point. Second point, what is Islamophobia? Right? Islamophobia isn't simply bigotry. It isn't simply animus. It isn't simply the guy next door saying that Muslims are all violent and evil. No, it's far more comprehensive, far more complex than we caricature it. Right? And I write about this in a piece I published in the Columbia Law Review. First, Islamophobia is private violence, right? The form that we typically understand, it's manifested through attacks on mosques. It's manifested on attacks on individuals who are conspicuous and visible Muslims. It's manifested in a range of ways by private actors and private entities, right? Corporations, institutions, think tanks, but it's also structural, right? Islamophobia is also state-sponsored policy and the kinds of laws the state is enacting, the kind of programming, policing programs the state is engaged in. When I say state, I mean every level of the state, right? Federal government, state government. We see state structural Islamophobia by way of the anti-Sharia legislation that was prominent a couple of years back and now is obviously coming back to the fore. And third, and most importantly, it's a dialectic, right? State policy actually endorses these negative stereotypes, these ideas and images that are resonating with the broader polity, right? The citizenry. And during times of crisis, state policy and presidential rhetoric, like we see with Trump, can actually embolden private Islamophobia. So we have to understand what Islamophobia means, right? And grasp this framework before we freely use it. So the point, I want to kind of, I guess, elaborate on more fully when we get through this conversation is that Muslims can actually engage in Islamophobia, right? Muslims can partake and endorse structural Islamophobia. So the idea that just because we're Muslim, that we can't partake in this project of Islamophobia is a mythic one, right? It's not a real one. So that's an issue that I think is really critical to this conversation as we move forward. Third, the racialization of Muslims, that's one segment of it, right? So I think private Islamophobes view Muslims in very ethnically caricature terms, right? Synonymizing Muslims with Arabs and South Asians and so on. But the state has become far more nuanced. When we talk about state-sponsored Islamophobia, right, there's no longer a racialization of Muslims coming from the state. They understand the racial and ethnic diversity of Muslims. And second, they understand the sectarian diversity of Muslims and the political heterogeneity of Muslims. And the state capitalizes on this heterogeneity to extend and to enforce its structural Islamophobia. So those are three critical points that have to be had. And the fourth point, I think, is when we discuss issues like sideswiping, criticism, and that being, tasteless and so on, that's fine, right? And I think that's a conversation that has to be had. But I think it's actually distracting from the more robust and meaningful conversation as to the actual effects of the decision making, right? There's real consequences when a specific organization is endorsing counter-radicalization policy. I don't care what you're saying about me. What are you doing that's affecting my community is the question we really got to be focused in on, right? You can call me whatever you want. Hey, Professor Beydoun, you're too short. Professor Beydoun, I don't like your jacket. I don't care about that. You can say whatever you want to say about me. What decisions, how are my decisions impacting your community? That should be the question we hone in on more specifically, in my opinion.
Well, I want to follow up on that. So we know that Islamophobia is a historically embedded phenomenon. I mean, in fact, we can even go a step further and say that since the emergence of Islam, the West has never managed to come to peace with the rise of that religion. And the spread of Islam in the Middle East came as sort of was a very historical, fascinating thing. Is that Christianity had failed to ever to appeal to the hearts of the Middle East, or what we call the Middle East, and Islam did. And the Latinized Christianity has always struggled with that. And so we're dealing with a from the history of the Crusades to the history of colonialism to the rise of racist discourses in so-called liberal democracies, etc., etc. And the elephant in the room, Israel. Because Israel played a huge role in the Islamophobia industry and continues to do so. I mean, in fact, wherever you find discourse about stealth Islamists and Sharia creed, right on the other side of the page is support Israel. Israel is so we'll get to that. But that comes back to the critical question. Now, as Muslims who are full members, full citizens of Western democracies, and particularly in the U.S., strategically, wouldn't it make sense that we enter into partnerships with people that might not have a comprehensive understanding of Islamophobia, might even have a flawed understanding of Islamophobia, but have the intentionality of inclusion to one extent or another? And strategically, doesn't that make sense? You know, whether it is ties to people in Congress, ties to people in local political institutions, ties to law enforcement, whoever wants to work with us, we work with them. What is wrong with that? Or what is right with that?
Well, I think it's not right or wrong. I think it's where you contextualize that question. I think theoretically it sounds really aspirational, right? But when the specific context of that question is affixed within the war on terror, then it becomes problematic, right? Would you ask a black person to endorse or partake in the project of carrying forward the prison industrial complex, right? Would you ask a Latinx individual to partake in a program that is leading to expedited removals of individuals who look like them, right? So when we're talking specifically about the context of the war on terror in specific signature counterterror programming, whether it be NSEERS, whether it be counter-radicalization and so on, you're dealing with a program that is entirely built upon the premise that Muslim identity is correlative of radicalization. The theory is flawed. The entire theory is flawed and entirely fixated on Muslim identity, not on white supremacists and so on. So effectively what happens is that individuals who choose to participate in that process who are Muslim are effectively native informants, right? They're individuals who are effectively extending their racial or religious identity to endorse and carry forward projects that are destructive to their communities.
Well, native informants is a sophisticated concept because
and I use the academic term.
Yeah, I mean it has so many layers and I mean, for people who are watching this, you could be a native informant even though you never intended to be a native informant, and there are, but I mean, there's a range
of
wide range.
There's a range of motives that inspire individuals.
I want to come back because this is seriously a very difficult question. So we have a war on terror that has now been, in many ways, have been used to as a cover for the rebirth of various colonial policies, and in many ways, the war on terror has been used to even subvert democratic institutions. It has been used to extend hegemonic influence over so many parts of the world. It has been used to excuse systematic colonization of people in Palestine and so on. So it's a monster with so many different branches. But the reality is that it's like if you exist with this massive monster, and you are confronted with the question of what do you do about it? What should your policies, not long-term philosophy, but effective policies as you work with Muslim communities, as you work with the demands of families, individuals, communities, towards the people who embrace the war on terror, the idea of war on terror as sort of a crusading idea. It's a righteous idea. It's a righteous concept. It's a concept on the side of God, against the side of good against evil. How do you work with that? I mean, do you say, well, you know what, you are all participants on the war on terror, so I am not working with you. I am going to be a systematic, conscientious objector, so to speak. But what is the cost of that? Doesn't that have a prohibitive cost in itself?
Of course. Yeah, I mean, basically, so what is pernicious about the war on terror is this construction of a good versus bad Muslim binary, right? Scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani have written about this, And basically, the structure lays out a game, for instance, where it creates incentives for specific organizations and individuals to play the good Muslim role, and individuals to participate with power to carry forward this programming. And as a consequence of individuals choosing to play the good Muslim role, that's branding anyone who isn't playing that role as a presumptive bad Muslim.
Okay, I'm happy to I was going to come to you.
Okay.
Okay, this idea of good and bad Muslim, because I'm happy you brought this up. And I'm gonna
the war on terror is built upon that binary.
Yeah, absolutely, and I understand that. But I'm going to ask you a question. Feel free to answer it, and then say whatever you want in commenting about what Khaled said. Don't we? I mean, the idea is that the war on terror creates this binary, this dichotomy between the good boy and the bad boy, right? And if you behave, you get your little kudos, you get your little awards. If you misbehave, we smack you, we suppress you, we disappear you effectively. And this type of binary is very old. It's anchored in not just in the you could trace it marvelously in the Roman Empire and the way the Roman Empire dealt with everyone. But then in colonialism, and it has this long-rooted history of those who colonize others create this binary and give incentive for those who work with them and destroy those who oppose them. But you know what troubles me is, don't we have a theological imperative to differentiate between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim? And here I'm talking from a moral perspective and a theological perspective. I, as a Muslim, on the one hand, I know that there's this monster in the room that wants me to divide myself according to this binary of good and bad. But on the other hand, I have another master, Allah, God, who also demands that I divide myself in terms of good and bad. Now, so how do we negotiate this? I mean, I'm sure you deal with this in impact all the time, because ultimately you have a moral duty to define yourself in the eyes of God as good versus bad. But how do you do so with the presence of this outside pressure that wants you to also define yourself as good or bad? How do you negotiate this?
Well, I think, first of all...
It's a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think these conversations can go on for quite some time.
They should.
And they should. But you guys are talking theory, I deal with realities. And there are so many realities in the community. I've been working in the community for 30 years. Whether it was the time that we fought against the first Gulf War in '91, or the second Gulf War, or the Salman Rushdie crisis, or the Oklahoma City bombing, or so many things. This problem that you wrote about, Khaled, in the Great Theft, of extremism that took away our religion and hijacked it to this narrative of what we call the cult of death, is a reality. You're fighting that while you're fighting the policies that are nefarious and they're targeting your community and they're aimed to scapegoating you, and you're fighting all the special interest groups. So we cannot ignore any of them. You can't just say, well, I'm fighting the U.S. government, but you're ignoring this problem of extremism that is espoused not just by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but so many voices. And again, your book documents the historical roots of that. So yes, people are always pushing you to say, you know, who's the good Muslim, who's the bad Muslim, and who's who's the real Muslim, who's the tough Muslim, and who's the soft Muslim, and so on and so forth. So I don't deal with binaries. I deal with realities, and I deal with people. And so when we deal with this problem, and then we use the term native informant, who then is a native informant? For example, is Khizr Khan a native informant because he spoke at the Democratic National Committee because his son died in Iraq defending American soldiers? Is he a native informant?
Do you know what native informant means?
It's somebody that they claim to be the representative of that community that is selected by someone from the outside.
Hold on, because I'm going to ask you to explain to comment on native informant. But let's not finish.
But is he capitulating to the military-industrial complex because he spoke and he was viewed as not just a good Muslim but a great American voice?
Can I add the example of Muzammil Siddiqui issued a fatwa
Against terrorism.
Against terrorism.
Yeah, the Fifth Council actually.
Yeah, on behalf of the Fifth Council.
Right. The Fifth Council issued that. Dr. Marayati issued a declaration against extremism. We have people that are taking positions within the government or in commissions, like Khaled Beydoun took a position in the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Does that mean that he's the good Muslim? And I'm sorry.
You need to inform.
Yeah, and I do remember even you, Khaled, that you did a video for the State Department, about democracy. So does that make you a native propagandist for the U.S. government because you did that video? So it's not this binary that all the time. I think that people, yes, they do have to make difficult choices, and they do, and a lot of times it is the lesser of the two evils. Do you deal with that issue or do you ignore it and do you move on to something else? Do you fight this issue or do you fight that issue? Is it something coming from the Middle East or is it something in your neighborhood? These are the realities, and while we can talk about theories of Islamophobia and of racialization in this society, I think the bottom line is Muslims, especially young Muslims, are trying to see how their Muslim identity fits within their personal lives, in their schools, in their work, as they see Islam being smeared every day to this day on media, and these are the challenges we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
One thing I do want to interject before I come back to Khaled Beydoun is that there is no distinction between theory and reality in my view. Theories are ultimately attempts to both describe reality and engineer and direct reality. I mean, a theory that doesn't aspire to change the way people think and behave is nothing. It becomes just a pure abstraction that's a mental exercise. And I think even when you say in the examples that you gave, you cite the great theft. That is theory and reality. I mean, it is an attempt to think about systematically about various elements that constitute reality, and then to come to a conclusion about what they are and what they should be. So I take your point that you are concerned about ideological tropes that would that ignore the complexity of reality. But that just means that the theory, if that is happening, then the theory is flawed. It doesn't mean that the theory is irrelevant.
Right.
And
I think that the theory is shortchanges a lot of what people are
but
struggling
not
with.
all theories, because and I'm going to talk about this concept of native informant in a second, because within the theoretical constructs, I mean, ultimately they try to educate and try to direct the behavior of people. People just don't produce theories for their own sake. They produce them for a purpose. So, just so we're all clear, talk about the concept of native informant and what it means, because I think there's, within even the theoretical constructs of native informant, it does address a lot of our realities. I mean, it does directly apply to a lot of our realities, and the issue is often, regardless of the label, well, even if our role becomes partially that of a native informant, does the balance of harms and goods mandate that we play that role?
Yeah. I'm going to try to finesse two questions into one. So I want to address the theory issue and then tie into the native informant question. So, look, theory and praxis are inherently tied. I would highly recommend that nobody navigate a specific practical project before they understand the theory driving that practical project. Counter-radicalization is a classic example. If you look at the theory that's laid forth by Michael Silber and Arvind Bhatt, right, the two, I call them pseudo-scholars who construct a theory. It's premised entirely on, again, exclusively framing radicalization as a Muslim phenomenon, right? And more specific to that, a Sunni phenomenon. So if you're embracing or partaking in programs like that without reading the theory, then I classify you as being highly informed, right? Or making decisions that are driven by ignorance or driven by some other incentives that exist beyond that. Okay, moving on to the native informant idea. The native informant construct, it's a spectrum, right? There are native informants who engage in programming that are highly pernicious, whether we talk about the war on terror, whether we talk about, the African American experience, racialized criminal policing, and so on. If you endorse that sort of programming, that might lead you to the more extreme side of the spectrum. Maybe we can call it a brazen native informant, right, versus a more innocuous or benign native informant, right? There's native informants like Ayan Hirsi Ali or Asra Nomani, Urshid Manji would fit on the latter end of the spectrum, right? There are individuals who fit on the more benign spectrum who are engaged in, let's say, programming that the state engages in that isn't as nefarious or destructive to marginalized groups. Now, the reason I classify, I think the impact of the native informant hinges on the specific space in which they're operating, right? So I would classify that the most destructive war on terror program in recent time is counter-radicalization policing, right? Do you have to address issues that are germane to reconciling Muslim identity and American identity within that space? Why can't it be had through different departments of government? The Department of Education, for instance, right? Many Muslims, especially where I come from in Detroit, are poor and working class. Why can't we address these questions within the Department of, Housing and Urban Development, right? Issues that are germane to Muslims are driven by the media, right? Film, news media, popular media, and so on. Why can't we address these questions through the FCC, right? If we're only addressing this question in the primary space in which we're addressing the issue of reconciling Muslim and American identity is within the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Defense, then it becomes highly problematic and clearly vivid that the state is effectively exploiting or capitalizing on your collaboration to advance a specific wartime project. And by wartime, I mean domestic war on terror or global war on terror, that we have to be more intelligent as Muslims, right? As Muslim Americans, to say that, look, there are clear issues we have to resolve. And I want to challenge the idea that radicalization is this, scary kind of, highly rampant issue within the Muslim American community, because I don't think it is. I don't see any research saying that, Muslim Americans and young youth are driven to violence or radicalization or committing terror attacks. The stats say otherwise, actually. The government stats say that Muslims and nominal Muslims are actually not engaged in terror attacks. right? And terrorism, again, we know in this country is defined very subjectively and very politically. So we just have to be intelligent to say that we got our issues, no doubt, right? We got issues with regard to, existential questions and identity, but we're not going to address these issues with the state within the War on Terror project. And to do so is not intelligent and drives me to kind of think about what other motives are at play. Why are organizations and individuals choosing to accept those terms of the game when they're clearly stacked against us and against our interests?
Let's take the discussion to some more particular issues. And so, MPAC in a recent report that I read, I don't know if you've seen this report.
Yeah, I think I got a copy with me. Yeah, I got it.
Specifically and expressly condemns, differentiates between CVE programs, which are, do either of you care to define CVE? Because I don't want to do it.
So yeah, I think part of the problem is there's no one definition of CVE, and you can go to 2 different people and get 3 different opinions on that. And I've been to debates about CVE. People walk out and say, I still don't know what CVE is. But for the purpose of what MPAC is trying to do, let me try to explain it this way.
Because MPAC differentiates between safe spaces and CVPE.
Exactly.
And condemns CVPE but endorses safe spaces.
I mean, safe spaces as Dr. Heather Laird Jackson, who just founded the Muslim Mental Health Center at USC, and you spoke at her conference some weeks ago, Khaled. She wrote this report on behalf of MPAC, and we were approached by Mayor Eric Garcetti, who said his office said, we have $20,000. We'd like to give it to the Muslim community, and you can use it as you see fit. MPAC did not make any money from that. It was used purely for programming. So what Dr. Heather Laird did was that she set up a counseling center within the Islamic Center. And the counseling dealt with the whole, was really a holistic approach. So for example, if somebody had problems, there was one family that had a recent suicide. So dealing with the grievances of the family. Another family, their boy was on drugs, dealing with those issues. Another family, a person was thinking about suicide, suffering from depression. Domestic violence, women who were suffering from domestic violence. So that's what the program was used for. I mean, that's where the $20,000 was used for. And then she wrote this report, and she says that the Safe Spaces model is rooted in a community-led approach to well-being and resilience by fostering an open and supportive environment and creating access to counseling and behavioral health services. This is, as we say, this is an alternative to both heavy-handed law enforcement tactics and government-led countering violent extremism programs. And so the way we looked at it is, the government came and said, we want, this thing called, first of all, this issue came partly because MPAC successfully lobbied the Bush administration to not use the term Islamic terrorism when it was talking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So there was a report that was actually done through the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security that basically argued why the U.S. government should stop using the term Islamic terrorism. And that's when they came up with the term violent extremism. President Obama then came and said, well, let's see if we can deal with these issues in a way that empowers communities or helps communities deal with these problems. And at that time, we were dealing with the Times Square bombing. We had just dealt with the Boston Marathon bombing. And the question was, can our community help rehabilitate individuals? And we argued just exactly what Khaled said, Mr. Beydoun said, that this is not an epidemic. When you look at violence from the right and white nationalists, it far outweighs these episodes that we're talking about here. However, because of the media, because of so many things, the hysteria is imminent, and we have to deal with the situation. And every Muslim organization then issues statements and talks about it as a problem and condemns it and deals with it in their own way. When it came to this issue of countering violent extremism, what MPAC actually did was they took a bad policy and provided an alternative. And so instead of being a government-led approach, we said, make it a community-led approach, which is exactly, by the way, what CARE National said. CARE National said, CARE supports community-led CVE programs. And so we said, let it be bottom-up, not top-down. We don't want government coming in and telling us what to do. The FBI wanted to, for example, do this Don't Be a Puppet program, and the Shared Responsibilities Committee. MPAC lobbied against it, and those programs were shrunk, if not terminated. And I think as a result of our lobbying against it. So we said, let it be community-led, not government-led. And again, the other point that Khaled was making about why are we talking about DHS with these issues? Why aren't the funds coming from HHS, Health and Human Services? So we continue to lobby, and not successful, but we continue to lobby that if you want any funding for these kinds of programs, it should come from Health and Human Services, not Homeland Security. Number 3, we said this stigmatizes, the CVE policy is flawed because it stigmatizes Muslims, and it shouldn't be singling out Muslims. And again, we talked to President Obama, and our DC office actually did that in one of the White House iftars. In fact, while other people were taking photo ops, we did work, and we lobbied that white supremacy be added to the list of concerns when it comes to countering violent extremism. And now when you talk to law enforcement, when you talk to major officials in Homeland Security, they include white supremacy when it comes to this problem. So this report, which I think spells out our work, it says that no law enforcement should be involved in this program. And we succeeded in getting Mayor Eric Garcetti and the City of Los Angeles to engage with us on this issue without law enforcement. If law enforcement, in other words, if law enforcement wants to do their own CV program, they got to do it without us. They're not going to do it with any Muslim organization. This is done purely from a mental health, public health framework, not from a criminal justice, Homeland Security framework. So this program actually benefited 200 people in counseling services within a month. And I'm also helping Heather Laird now build a Muslim mental health center in Maryland. Recently there were 4 suicides by Muslims, Muslim suicides, unfortunately, in the state of Maryland. And so we're trying to open up a Muslim mental health center. Now, the question is, well, why did you guys take money from the city? The reality is, and again, this is where I think theory, and you guys are the theory experts, you need to catch up to some of the realities in our community.
I'm also an organizer and a long-time advocate in the Detroit community.
Okay.
So I'm not only an academic.
Well, then you should understand what I'm talking about.
I do.
That the problem is the Muslim community is not funding these programs. They're not funding, for example, institutes that are thinking about these cutting-edge issues. They're not fundraising for Muslim mental health centers. They're not funding these programs that we can tell somebody, if your family is suffering from any kind of problem, come to us for help. There was a case in Portland and a case in Fremont, California. Portland, Oregon, Fremont, California. The father was worried about the son joining Al-Qaeda or ISIS, right? So what did the father do? He called the FBI. So what we're saying is, instead of calling the FBI, call the community leaders. And what Safe Spaces has is called a community resource team. It comprises the imam, a chair of the board, a public health expert, a mental health expert, a communications person. In other words, people from the community that can spread the word. If you need help, come to us. We will try to help this individual. And as you know, a mental health expert, and especially Heather Laird, is strict when it comes to confidentiality of her clients. So we take care of the safeguard of the confidentiality by giving these issues to mental health experts instead of me, even myself, or any community organizer or imam, or trying to figure out what to do in these cases.
Well, again,
Can I respond a couple of them?
let me just, I'll say something, then we can do so. I read this report, and it has the intake forms, which are, as you would expect, they're all legally compliant under HIPAA, and so all the expected professional confidentiality arrangements are there. What I thought was rather, the report also cites a great deal of research material about the fact that extremism and violence, something around and hurt people, hurt others, is not a theological issue. It's a psychological issue, and it discusses what I thought was fascinating, the idea of the epistemic crisis that drives people to a point of despair where they hurt themselves or hurt others, and the whole pilot project that is documented here is basically providing health services to a community where instead of them paying out of pocket, the money came out of the 20,000, and then it says that if the money runs out, they might be responsible for paying their own bills. But it's an expensive thing. I mean, the counseling sessions are.
It's for the underprivileged. Yeah.
But it's still. I mean, it's like $250 an hour.
Right.
But what is also fascinating is the community seems to have rushed in to avail itself of this, and a lot of the problems are the problems that you would normally see in families in the U.S. Divorce, broken families, serious psychological issues, and so on. So, but I go back to ultimately the question: well, how would, I mean, other than the point of responding, that how would you evaluate a pilot program like this in your view?
Yeah. So the pilot program standalone, and I read the report yesterday, seems good-spirited. It seems like it's well-intentioned. Again, the objectives of the Safe Spaces program to address mental health issues, issues of disaffection are issues that should be addressed. But again, they have to be contextualized within the practical space in which they're being extended. Now, you received funding from the LAPD, or the mayor.
No, this wasn't LAPD.
It was the mayor, right?
This is the mayor.
This is the mayor, who obviously has a close connection with LAPD, which is conducting hardline CV policing program.
This has nothing to
do.
This has nothing.
This
has nothing to do with LAPD.
Okay.
Mayor Eric Garcetti, I think everybody here in Los Angeles knows, is one of the strongest supporters of Muslims in the country. He visits mosques all the time, and he speaks.
So did President Obama.
He doesn't want $20,000, by the way, to ruin his relationship with the Muslim community. This is not about doing something for LAPD or for CVE. This is purely something that he did.
The mayor is the executive of the city, in which the city's police department conducts one of the 3 hardline CV policing programs in the country. That's one point. Second point is, you've received federal CVE funding before.
That's a lie. You keep saying that.
It's documented.
No, it's not. You are mixing, either you're mixing up terms, or you're spreading a lie. I have never received CVE money. Okay? And then you put in your book that we got $400,000.
It's documented.
But where? Because we never got it. You were wrong. You're not doing good research, Khaled.
I'm doing great research.
No, you're not. We did not
I
receive
don't
the
want
money.
this
I'll tell you
into an
what happened.
Guys.
All right? Trump rescinded the grant, because
Did you apply to the grant?
Yes, of course we did.
Okay.
So did Care Florida.
Let me ask you a specific question.
No.
You've talked for a long time. I'm gonna ask you a specific
guys,
question.
Let me just finish this
I'm gonna ask you a specific.
That is a lie.
I want to ask
and
you.
Spreading a
I
falsehood.
want to ask you a specific question.
Sure.
So can you give a cogent definition of CVE?
Which definition?
Why?
Which version?
Why are you asking
Because
that
why
question?
would you?
I
Because
just said there are
Khaled,
totally different
direct
definitions.
your comments to me.
He said,
guys, hey, I am in control of this session. I don't want it to descend into an argument. So direct your comments to me.
Okay, so
I'm the bad guy here.
no, there's no good or bad
Okay.
guys. I disagree with much of what he said.
So
but I don't consider him a bad guy.
I'm interested in your
So the
your
question I
evidence,
had-
and because it's all relevant to serious policy issues. So
this is the question that I have.
Yeah.
If I can spell it out.
okay, just
Okay.
hold on.
All right,
So-
I want to answer.
Okay.
I'll let you.
Salam said earlier that there are various definitions of CVE, counter-radicalization, and so on. Which, again, the state-adopted definition of CVE is clearly evident in the reports that drive the program, right? So President Obama established countering violent extremism in August of 2011. It's clearly established by memo. Anybody can read it. Now, you said earlier that you didn't have a fully established definition of CVE, but why would you apply to get funds from a program in which you don't know what it is specifically? If I'm applying to a specific program for funding, I want to know what it is. So whether you received the funds or not, you went ahead and applied for the grant.
Khaled can be the mediator here.
Because
I have an answer.
Because we're missing two things. I mean, I'm interested in, on one hand, I'm interested in evaluation of this particular pilot program. On the other, we raised the issue of applying for funding. Do you want to answer to the part about applying for funding?
We applied for safe spaces. Nonprofits apply for their programs and they find 10 or 20 different entities. You're a professor. You guys apply for grants all the time. You see where there's some area where your program can be funded. You apply for the grant. And let me prove another point here. Khaled Beydoun is not concerned about CVE. He's concerned about impact. Because Masjid Muhammad did receive the $400,000. And they are running the program. But instead, Khaled Beydoun insists that it's impact that took the $400, which is a lie and a falsehood. And
when you say Khaled Beydoun, where's that documented? In the book. I have 17 other law review articles in which I mentioned that.
Okay, well, that book says...
that's one book, my friend.
You need to retract that, because it's
no,
wrong.
I don't. You applied to the grant.
No, you said we got
$400,000. I'm not retracting anything.
And number... Okay,
hold on. So I just want to understand. So you're saying that
they applied for the funds.
So you're spreading a lie.
Did you apply for the funds?
We did not get the money.
Did you apply for the funds?
Everybody. Okay, let me go over what other people applied for.
There's a larger point here, but let Salam say what he wants first. Yeah.
Unity Productions applied for it. Masjid Muhammad applied for it. Care Florida applied for it. But for some reason, Khaled Beydoun is only fixated on MPAC. And as far as CVE, you have colleagues of yours who are doing CVE work. Like Abbas Barzagar, who's doing now CVE for the British Council. Sahar Aziz and Zarina Garal, who are anti-CVE, are fellows at the Center for Global Policy that just wrote a report on advancing CVE programs. Nihad Awad went to Saudi Arabia for a CVE conference. But for some reason, you are obsessed only with MPAC. So you're not anti-CVE, you're just anti-MPAC.
Based on what? Based on what reading?
I just said right here.
No, but based on what reading of my position?
Guys,
a book? The book?
Yeah, I mean,
I've read extensively about CVE.
You do, okay, then why don't you comment on?
I gotta say, you're critiquing my
research. Why
research.
don't you comment on Masjid Muhammad then? Why is it? No, you have not. You have. Is it in your book?
No,
this is not the only thing I've written, man.
Why is it MPAC in your
articles.
book, but not these other groups? Why is it that you single out MPAC? Okay, this is the problem with
you caricature support of CVE as specifically getting funding. Okay, you've conducted a range of parallel programs beyond funding that endorse and enable CVE to function. My idea is that LA was chosen as a pilot program because your organization was identified as a strategic partner that could carry forward CVE. So let's not be narrow-minded and say that funding is the specific space and the exclusive space that enables CVE to be carried forward. It's far more robust than that. And we both know that.
Okay, our model was community-led approach, which is an alternative to government-led CVE.
But wait, so let's...
We can talk about funding, that's only one sliver of it, though.
Hold on. So, because I've read a lot of your work, and I do know that in your articles you do talk about other Muslim organizations that have received CVE and so on. I mean, whatever considerations that what material went into the book, we all know that scholars expect their whole body of work to be read, which is perhaps not what
well, if someone's to make an indictment, they should base it on a global assessment of
somebody's work. There's a
making
serious
indictments all
there's
the
a
time,
question.
and it's wrong. It's
I
baseless.
know. Can you just hold on, guys? So the question that I have is this: do you have, which is a question, a different way of asking a question that Salam is raising, but I think let's air it out. Mm-hmm. Do you have an ideological issue with MPAC? I mean, do you see them as playing a more pronounced role in exactly the wrong type of trajectory that Muslim organizations?
Yes.
And why so?
Emphatically, yes.
So why?
I think MPAC has chosen to play the role of, again, I'll be frank, the good Muslim institutional role, where they're happy to effectively trade in political position, ideology, racial and religious currency, to be better embraced by the state, right? And again, to endorse more on terror policy programming through counter-radicalization, and not only on a federal level, but also their relationship with the LAPD, which we can talk about more fully, more closely if you like, which has very destructive programming within the city of Los Angeles. Remember, I lived in the city for 7 years, so I know Los Angeles quite well. I know activists in the city. So localized programs which have a destructive impact on black and brown people in the city, and specifically poor and working class brown and black people in the city. So I think MPAC has fully embraced the positionality of being, we're going to collaborate with the state because there's specific incentives we can extract from that relationship. And I've written about this in the book. I've written about this in a range of law review articles, but not only MPAC, other organizations as well.
But you don't, I mean, and the incentives, I know in your writing, the incentives not necessarily just financial.
Not just financial, no. So getting invited to the White House for iftars and so on.
No, I go back.
They sent me invitations for a reason.
What a treat.
But okay,
Wonderful.
so now I go back to this.
You call that trading in for that? We're trading in everything, so we get invited to White House iftars. That is the most cockamamie thing I've ever heard. It's just ridiculous. I'm sorry.
I don't think
it's an insult to my intelligence.
I just don't understand.
For you to say that we're doing all this so that we can get invited to White House.
Okay,
that's not what I said.
You're like larger. No, but that's a reduction. That's a reduction
exactly.
point.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing.
But hold on. What he's saying is that, and again, I will elevate things to an intellectual point of view, and the intellectual point of view is that Khaled Beydoun is a critic of impact as a prototype of what he sees as a wrong-headed policy. The wrong-headed policy is that we work with the state, and what we get out of this is a certain level of recognition by the state. That the state, not financially and not necessarily, just iftars or whatever it is, but the state basically likes us and that at a psychological level that becomes, even if it's not necessarily conscious, but that becomes an incentive system that instead of noticing the suffering and the dispossessed, you would become more sensitized to approval and consent of the state. And that's why I started with the issue of power. What is your response to that?
Yeah, it's a cockamamie idea. You know me, Khaled. Okay?
I do.
You really want to believe that I have done 30 years of work and traded in the community or whatever ethics we have in our religion, and when our religion tells us to fight for the poor and the oppressed so that I can be approved by the state, it's a ludicrous point. MPAC, okay, like ADC, like AAI, like CARE, like every nonprofit that works in Washington has a government relations office. Government relations mean you go and you talk to the people in the government, and you talk about issues that are important to them, and you try to bring something that benefits the community. And I'll give you examples of our relationship, by the way, with local law enforcement here. We had a relationship with the sheriff, and Peter King, the congressman from Long Island, had a hearing on radicalization of mosques. So we got the sheriff to go to Washington and basically tell Peter King, you don't know what you're talking about. The Muslim community is an asset to our country. It is a blessing to our country, and you guys need to know the Muslim community better. You need to do a better job of knowing the Muslim community. That testimony, along with Keith Ellison's passionate testimony, pretty much killed the hearing after that. Mike Downing, another person that we developed a relationship with, he has fought Steve Emerson and Daniel Pipes. He has fought the Islamophobes. He has fought them when they're trying to make the Muslim Brotherhood the Sharia scare in this country. And he even said, you guys are demonizing the Brotherhood. These are the relationships we had with a very specific purpose of developing those relationships and leveraging them so that they can also, along with us, speak out against this anti-Muslim bigotry. I went to Robert Mueller when he was the FBI director, when there was all this anti-Muslim training, and I wrote an op-ed about it. And I even met, I was with Abed Ayoub in that meeting of ADC, and we worked together to tell him that that anti-Muslim training has to stop. So you tell me, is that somehow, getting power from the state? I see it as serving the community. There is a nuance here that is very critical in policy and government relations work. Yes, you can go and go work with the government so that you can be seen as with the government, or you can go and work to represent the sentiments and the interests of the community to the government. MPAC's track record is very clear. It represents the sentiments and the interests of the American Muslim community to the U.S. government and to the local government as well. And I believe we've done a very effective job.
I want to take this again to a specific example, because I do know Salam and I do know you. And I know both of you are extremely sincere, and both of you are extremely committed. And this is, again, for me, it underscores the importance of thinking and theory, not undermines it, because when two very sincere people and two very committed people, they must be able to build bridges. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble. I mean, they must be able to understand each other's perspectives, because I know that each of you is not ill-willed. You're not on the Saudi payroll, on the Zionist payroll, or whatever other payrolls exist. Unlike a lot of people, most of you live in poverty.
I used to, not anymore. I get to.
It's still poverty. You don't know how rich people live. It's true. Yeah.
True.
By LA standards, you're poor, man. So
I'm hood rich.
Okay. So, I mean, I watched an engagement with Downing, where Downing is speaking and refuting the idea of Sharia creep. Okay, and he's saying, Sharia is not a threat to the United States, and this demonization of Muslims has to stop it. He's challenged by an Islamophobic group, the part of some of the authors of that Sharia threat book, and there was all the remarkable bigoted things that you can imagine. It's available on the net. I can send it to you. And Downing actually argues with them and say, and they get into even a sort of a silly thing where the Sharia, the racists are saying, oh well, those people, they closed the doors of Ijtihad centuries ago, so there's no new thinking. They're basically stuck from in the Middle Ages, so you can't take anything they say in the modern age seriously. And Downing is actually saying, well, it's not that easy, and so on. And I was very amused because they're grappling with concepts that the racists are deploying for their reasons, and Downing is trying to refute them. Now, when MPAC reacts to the well-intentioned actions by someone like Downing, by giving them an award, and you commented that this is bowing down to white supremacy. Is that correct?
I think it was 3 months after the LAPD had killed an unarmed black man not far from downtown LA named Ezell Ford. I just thought it was symbolically very poor political decision-making by MPAC, especially during the heights of the Black Lives Matter movement, when a significant percentage of Muslims are in fact black. I lived in downtown LA, and this man was killed not far from where I lived a couple of years ago, and they awarded a department which is engaged in systematic profiling of black and brown people and poor people in the city. After the murder of an individual.
But this brings me back to our dynamics with power, Khaled, because we live in LA, right? Mm-hmm. And we've got a police department that, if it decides to be hostile to us as Muslims, it could make our lives extremely difficult, right? I mean, a few years ago, I used to have halaqas in this place, and as students were leaving this place, cops would stop them. Mm-hmm. Through interventions where it was LAPD, it stopped. So none of you, inshallah, will be stopped by cops as you are leaving. Inshallah. And when we get to the nitty-gritty of dealing with trying to soften the impact of power and the brutality of power, is this the voice of a critic that comes and says, you sell out? Or isn't that a brutal thing? Isn't that a thing that actually compromises my, I mean, it puts me in between a rock and a hard place? I want to soften the brutality of power, but at the same time, I am being criticized for working with power to attempt to soften it.
So I'm a scholar. I don't use terms like that. And nowhere in my public writing will you find me call any organization or individual a sellout, right? But I do use academic and scholarly terms like that of the native informant, right? I'm not using it in its everyday discursive parlance. I'm using it in the way that academics use it. So I think that kind of language can be destructive. I've never had a social conversation with Salam. Your brother's a friend of mine, so we have many common friends. I don't think that the intentions are necessarily malicious. I don't know what the intentions are. I'm not going to engage in that game. I'm concerned as a scholar and as an advocate in the practical consequences of specific decisions.
I use sellout just to dramatize, but let's. What is in the scenario I just set out? Yeah. Okay. What would you're also an activist? Yeah. What, as an activist, what would be your decisions? Yeah. How would you deal with this type of situation?
Well, I think appeasement, right, and then appeasement by way of endorsing or awarding a department that is doing bad things in communities is not the way to go. Right, that's the number one decision that I'd make in my mind. Second, I live in Detroit. Right, Detroit is a city that's been surveilled well before 9/11. I can share an anecdote with you. where scholarship and theory and practice actually meet, right? Much of my scholarship in recent years is focused on counter-radicalization. The state, when I say the state, I mean FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, has become very intelligent as to how to capitalize on specific fissures within the Muslim community to advance programs like counter-radicalization. One of the organizations in Detroit that was to receive a large grant last year was a group called the Lebanese American Heritage Club, which was primarily a Shia-based Lebanese community social center. And I recognized from my research that the state was giving this organization a large grant because they recognized that Shia Muslims, right, had a common enemy, a kindred enemy with the state. And again, the state again was characterizing radicalization as a Sunni phenomenon.
Right.
And this organization was more than happy to partake in counter-radicalization programming. And when we talk about counter-radicalization programming, Salam makes a good point. There are distinct types. There are hardline counter-radicalization programming, which are conducted by law enforcement, and soft counter-radicalization programming, which are guised in the form of mentorship programs, mental health programs, community task force programs, and so on. But the soft programs enable the hardline programs to operate. So there's an intimate connection there that we can talk about if you want to have that conversation. But me and a number of activists in the community stepped up and made it public that this organization was taking $500,000 of renewable funds to carry forward counter-radicalization programming in Sunni spaces, in Sunni communities in Detroit. And we got them to disavow the funds. We got them to disavow the funds. So theory drives praxis. If you don't know what you're grappling against, then you can't launch, you can't spearhead an intelligent, practical intervention. That's why I asked the question of how do you define countering violent extremism, and you couldn't give a cogent definition, yet you were still happy to go ahead and apply for the funding.
Because we're applying for safe spaces, which is an alternative to countering violent extremism.
But you don't think it's tied?
Government programs. No, absolutely not. It's completely independent. Read the report. It's completely independent.
I've read the report.
So
But
it should just prove, and then I just need to correct a few things, though.
Good.
We didn't award the department. Again, this is stereotyping in reverse. We have a relationship with Mike Downing because of his comments against Islamophobes. It's that specific. And if we say, well, we shouldn't give him the award, that's like saying, well, yeah, I can understand why they shouldn't build the Park 57 mosque because of 9/11, and they shouldn't be awarding. It's the same. It's the same mentality. Is that you end up punishing an individual that, because of his affiliation. Yes, there's a problem with LAPD, and what MPAC did is it organized community leaders from Masjid Bilal, from Islah Center, from the Islamic Center of Southern California, from the mosques in the area, and we sat down with them about the need for police reform. And you know as well as I do, that's a long struggle. It's a struggle that's been happening way before us and will continue way after us. Yes, we are working against that issue of police brutality as well. So it's not, you said the word appeasing and awarding the department. I think, again, that's very misleading in saying that. It was specifically for Mike Downing, for what he said against these Islamophobes. Number two, I agree, we should protest a lot of these things, but at the end of the day, we have to offer some ideas beyond protest. We have to offer some kind of program, and in what Khaled was alluding to earlier, our moral tradition. لا تستوي الحسنة والسيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. Good and evil are not equal, so repel evil with that which is good and better, so that the one with whom there is enmity becomes as if he is your closest and warmest friend. So we are engaged in a mission of social transformation. And I agree, it doesn't happen at the policy. It doesn't happen at the policy end. It happens at the community level. It happens in our relationships with others as we join together, for the truth, as we join together for persevering against these evils. But we should look to these kinds of social conversions that the Quran is alluding to in terms of our moral tradition.
I'm interested in what you have to say to that.
So the issue with the LAPD.
Before you,
Yeah.
because I mean, this is, you know, the purpose of this conversation for me at least, it's to education, and
Yeah.
and it's another term is dawah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, education and dawah for me are interlinked in so many intimate ways. Part of the struggle that I personally think about all the time is one option is to say, you know, it is completely delusional to think that you can educate power and make even incremental or micro changes, because at the macro level, whatever micro advances you make would be lost, and it only ends up legitimating the ravages of power. But on the other hand, that seems to not sit well with the theology, the theological imperative of calling onto goodness, the obligation to educate regardless of what the consequences are, to create, to deal with whatever space you're in from a moral perspective, and from an educational perspective. It reminds me also, and in the history of colonialism itself, you know, we have been caught in the same epistemic dilemma now for generations. You know, colonialism comes in with a certain power dynamic. There are those who attempt to take care of community needs by dealing with micro spaces with colonialism, right? But at the same time, when you look at it from a macro perspective, from a long, you take a step back and you say, well, you know, ultimately, power subjugates and does what it wants and ends up exploiting even goodwill to its own purposes. That doesn't help me as a person who represents a community, because the option is to just become a social critic, to write books or to write articles or to demonstrate, to denounce someone receiving funds, but to not offer anything instead, because I don't know what to offer when it comes to savage power. I don't know what I can do about it that ultimately would be useful. And can we simply exist for generations? Because there's an intergenerational trauma when it comes to colonialism, basically as objectors and as protesters. Isn't that killing with a soul?
I agree with that point, but I don't think it's an ultimatum where the only avenue or space for practical intervention is within the state, right? There are grassroots models. So one model that we've launched in Detroit and hope to carry forward is to conduct these Know Your Rights counter radicalization programs within Masajid. Because typically speaking, these programs are being deployed in poor and working class communities where individuals are recent immigrants, are broadly ignorant about this programming and so on. And one thing that we need to address is the collateral First Amendment encroachments that CVE has, right? And it's destructive on these communities where young people who are conservative religiously, and even older people who are conservative religiously, are being identified as prospective radicals based on how they're presenting themselves. The motive question, I think, you're right, there is a moral imperative for us as Muslims to try to distinguish between what qualifies as good and evil. But I think we have to couple that with intelligence, right? So there's a moral imperative, but there's also an intellectual imperative to know that even when we mean good and expect to do good, we shouldn't be vulnerable and effectively be exploitable by state apparatuses that are merely using us to advance pernicious programming. So The moral imperative is definitely there, but so is the intellectual to understand the spaces in which we're operating in. May render me or a discrete number of us specific benefits, but is having a collective and collateral destructive impact on the broad range of us as Muslims.
Do you want to come to that?
I mean, again, no. I mean, I think on the issue of promoting these pernicious programs, while I agree with you in theory, I think what you say and what you write is practically slanderous. It says that you say that I take CVE money. You say that we took $400,000 from the Department of Homeland Security. Those are both wrong statements, and you don't want to correct them. So I think if we want to talk about the moral tradition, we should at least present information that is accurate and truthful, and definitely not misleading. And the second point, let me just finish this.
Did you held a phone conversation, I think in January, impacted, where you specifically stated that you would not disavow those funds?
For other reasons, Mr. Beydoun, because there are legal avenues to take. Where, as you know, you have to maintain standing.
But Beyond Claremont denounced those funds.
So, okay, everybody's.
Why didn't you?
I just told you.
What are? I'm a lawyer, so I understand.
I just told you.
Yeah.
In order to maintain legal standing, in order to take legal options against the administration for this policy. So that's a very reasonable, rational approach.
Who was your legal counsel? Because you can actually establish standing without having those funds.
Well, David Cole of the ACLU.
Okay.
But anyway, that's another matter. So you need to do better research on those issues. I think I would trust David Cole over you any day. But the other point is that...
Let's probe that.
No.
Why would you trust David Cole more than me?
Because I've worked with him, and,
Okay.
and we've established a relationship with mutual respect. From what I've seen, what I hear,
Has David Cole written about counter-radicalization?
He's written about the war on terror, yes.
Has he written about counter-radicalization?
He's written about a number of things, but he's an expert on this issue as it relates to the state. The other thing I want to mention is, this doesn't just affect me, because I think Khaled knows that I have thick skin, and usually these words just fall off my back. I've been attacked by Daniel Pipes. He's tried to cancel speakers from MPAC convention. He was not successful. I've been attacked by Steve Emerson. I was even a target of an assassination attempt by the Jewish Defense League in 2001. They tried to bomb my office, and law enforcement told me that they were out for me in particular. So I've been through that. And these things, honestly, it's nothing compared to what I've seen. However, Heather Laird Jackson, who did the Muslim Mental Health Center and had a conference, she was boycotted by Muslims in the name of fighting, CVE. Suhadu Beatty here, who runs our Hollywood bureau, was doing a civil rights panel with people in Hollywood. And some anti-CVE folks drew a petition to cancel that panel. My wife, who you may or may not know, is one of the leading activists for the Palestinian cause, and she's chair of Kinder USA. She was disinvited from a forum in Berkeley, Bears for Palestine, because they said that she was my wife, that because of the relationship with me. Again, in the name of anti-CVE. So it's not just First Amendment issues now, Mr. Beydoun. I think, back to the moral tradition, the Quran mandates that we must band together. That's the only time that we're going to create the critical mass. Because if I'm in my corner, and you're in your corner, and he's in his study, then, it's all fractured. It doesn't really matter what we do. But it says you have to band together to enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, so that those who are spreading corruption will be countered. If we don't band together and agree on a level of ethics in the discourse, then people will be boycotting, MPAC, and they'll be boycotting the Hollywood Bureau, they'll be boycotting Heather Laird Jackson, and it really it won't amount to much. So the moral tradition is to band together, and the moral tradition, as the Quran said, we are firm against injustice, but we should be merciful with one another.
I mean, when you hear about these boycotts,
Yeah.
I mean, and as a direct result, criticism of CVE, how does that strike you? Because I know that Salam does have very thick skin, you know, everything bounces off of him, but I think when things like Heather or Layla or whatever, that does have a different impact.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about a lot of these boycotts, to be frank with you. You know, my research area is the war on terror and counter-radicalization. I think that it's, you know, I'm uncomfortable with, I guess, a monolithic characterization of MPAC as an organization that just does CVE. I think, unfortunately, your work on the CVE front has stigmatized you in many respects. But I know that your organization does good work on many fronts. The Hollywood Bureau I follow really closely and does fantastic work with regard to countering negative representations of the Muslim community and so on. I think that it's unfortunate that members or individuals tied to MPAC have been treated that way. I don't endorse that, but I think, unfortunately, it's a foreseeable consequence of the decisions that the organization has made.
No. You can't have it both ways.
I'm not having it both ways. I'm just making an assumption. Look, I think
we as leaders have to stand for ethical discourse. When something like that happens, we should all say, stop it. Okay? That's all I'm saying. So I'm making an agreement with Hassan.
But why are you more focused on that? Why are you more focused on those issues when we shouldn't? So I agree with you that we have to band together during times of difficulty. And you said earlier, which I think is perhaps the most salient kind of revelation you made today, is that you don't have a definition of CVE and you don't know what it is, but you were still happy to advance and apply for the programming. No, let me ask you this question, please.
All right, go ahead.
So there are a number of scholars, and Muslim scholars, who write on counter-radicalization, right? Individuals who know the theory. I spent countless hours researching this stuff. I know it really well. People like Amna Akbar know it really well. People like Sahar Aziz know it really well. People like Aziz Haq, who's University of Chicago law professor, knows it really well. People like, if you don't want to talk to non-Muslims, because apparently you like David Cole a lot, people like Samuel Raskoff. David Cole's a great guy, but if you don't want to talk to non-Muslim scholars,
Muslims too.
Samuel Raskoff at NYU knows counter-radicalization really well. So the literature out there that is critical of CVE and counter-radicalization exists. Why not consult with these experts?
I guess my point was.
But why, if you don't have a definition of CVE, which you revealed earlier,
I don't have a definition.
Yes, you did. Why don't you consult?
I said there are 20 definitions out there.
Well, why don't you consult with the experts who can provide you with a crystal clear definition of what it is before taking action to apply for the programming?
You are singling out MPAC.
No, I'm not.
20 Muslim organizations, or if not 100, I'm not even sure how many, applied for the grant.
You're right.
You don't go after them. You go after MPAC. Let me
because
finish.
MPAC's been a partner on CVE for a long time.
No, we're not a partner on CVE. We're not a partner on anything that is government-led that is coming into our community. What we're telling the government is, we will handle our own business. That's it. That's what MPAC is actually telling the government. Now, as far as the government-led CVE, it's, you know, you can look it up in the strategic implementation plan of the White House, that it's about supporting initiatives against extremism. It's about the counter-narrative, and it's about partnership. Okay? Those are three elements of CVE that the government claims that it is trying to do. So that is their definition. That was my point. They have their definition. I don't agree with their points on stigmatization of Muslims and radicalization theories. In fact, I went to NYPD when they had their radicalization theory presentation and their paper on radicalization, and I debunked it, I dismantled it line by line. That's what I do because I am there to represent the community.
When I apply to the UCLA School of Law, I can't tell them, I don't like your curriculum, the curriculum should be this way. You still applied for the funding based on the existing structure of CVE programming. You didn't disavow the funding, it was stripped from you. Those are the facts.
It was stripped from us because we don't have a law enforcement component in the application.
No, it was stripped because the Trump administration stripped it for most.
Because Trump is anti-CVE, so you agree with Trump more than I do.
No, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we go back and forth.
Do you have
on these
fun,
issues.
like like talking about like simplistic platitudes?
No,
we're talking about heavy stuff.
No,
so when you
stop putting it on
when
Facebook.
you say things when you say things like I agree, you did not denounce or disavow CVE funding. It was stripped from you from Trump, who is moving away from CVE and proposing the program as being called Countering Islamic Violence. See, we're having a conversation where the guy you're talking to really knows what he's talking about. So these really simplistic platitudes you're throwing out aren't gonna stick, my friend.
I'm saying, and what doesn't stick is that there are 100 Muslim organizations that apply for it, and you don't go after them. Then go after them right now. I want to see you post it on Facebook. Those that got the funding, go after them now, because we are opposed to the government-led initiative that they're trying to impose in our community.
I mean,
go after them. I dare you.
He wants to have a Fox-related interview style
No,
discussion, which I have no interest in.
You're the one on Facebook that creates the Jerry Springer effect when people say, "Oh, tear him to shreds," and then you press like.
I didn't respond. Oh my! You're a president of an organization that is really talking about likes on Facebook.
Come on.
You're the one that's on Facebook all the time.
I'm an academic, man. I'm the president of an organization.
You're creating the Jerry Springer effect. That is creating infighting in the community, and the Muslim community is tired of it. That's what I'm hearing.
I think the Muslim community should be more tired of the kind of programming you're endorsing versus the rhetoric that you're
Guys, okay. Listen. You know, the purpose of this event was actually to try to get you to soften the rhetoric. Now, when we have a meeting like this and then the rhetoric escalates, we defeat the whole point. The whole point. I mean, when you see each other, I mean, you already good friends with Khaled, Salam's brother, but there is one thing clear in my mind, and that is that there are no villains in this conversation. You know, and this is where the intellectual issue comes. There are intellectual perspectives, and neither of these intellectual perspectives is. I don't endorse the idea that one is embedded in reality and one is embedded in fantasy. But they see the world as a result of their own experiences, as a result of their own studies, of their own cognitive processes, and it doesn't help when we come out of this conversation with greater animosity and hostility. I mean, let's put it this way: if perspective, if one is under the impression that Khaled Beydoun has a chip of, on his shoulder against impact, well, this is an opportunity to fix that this misunderstanding, to adjust the behavior, to clarify the air. I mean, this event should not. You should not leave this event with greater level of angst. It's not gonna. It doesn't help the Muslim community. I mean, one thing that is, what I want is people to hear this conversation and then make up their own minds. And I don't think it helps people make up their own minds when we provide fireworks. Fireworks confuse the mind.
Like I said, when people attack me, I really don't care, and you know I can go back and forth on issues. But when people around me, like Sue Abbey, like Heather Laird Jackson, like Layla al-Marayati, are boycotted because of this issue, that's what bothers me. It's not just words anymore. It is infighting, and that's what has to stop. And people say, well, you know, why do you go and talk to people, the government, about these issues? Because that's government engagement. That's what we do. That's our mission. We're supposed to go and engage the government. That doesn't mean we endorse the policy.
But any time that you two get heated with each other,
I'm just passionate.
Yeah, but I can imagine the Islamophobes sitting there chuckling and be extremely happy. So you know, this is a time where you err on the side of good faith. You know, even if you believe that there are several possible interpretations, pick the one that is. I don't think. I mean, I read through the Facebook exchange, to be, I mean, I don't think Facebook is a reliable medium for anything.
I agree.
People say garbage on Facebook,
Yeah.
and that's not that's not what we should be talking about. But what we should be talking about is that I'm interested in we didn't. Ultimately, whatever the history is, the CVE engagement developed and mutated into the Safe Spaces program that Heather Lard wrote about, right? And I'm still not clear. What is your assessment of this particular experience? Because I mean, this could be replicated by other Muslim organizations around the country. You know, you can't get Muslim donors to give money so you can provide health services to the community. So you will take money where, and like a lot of academics, you know, we apply for money, for grants from all types of places. Now, of course, I understand there, you know, the reason that there are academics that remain without money to buy time out and do their research is because they refuse to apply to all types of venues, and you know, most of us know that quite well. But do you object, and on what grounds, to what the pilot program that was made by MPAC here and Heather? I mean, the community needs mental health services, and we need funds for it. And if it comes through this venue, so what?
Okay, so I'm going to break it down legally how this will function, right? Because we can talk.
Leave out the First Amendment issue because that's my last question.
Aside from the First Amendment issue, an issue that was addressed.
Establishment clause.
Establishment and free exercise and political speech, actually, and association. So 4 clauses in the First Amendment that we can talk about that CVE impacts directly. But with regard to the Safe Spaces program, on its face, no, it's well-intentioned, it's well-structured, and it's a program I would endorse beyond the context in which it operates, right? So again, and he's gonna say otherwise, but based on my assessment, MPAC has had a close working relationship with DHS and a close working relationship with the LAPD, both of which are entirely committed to advancing hardline CVE programming and again soft CVE programming. Okay, we gotta be smart. I have no issue with this man as an individual. I just have an issue with the decisions the organization is taking. We can go out, have coffee after this if you'd like. We don't have to. Let me finish though. I ain't done.
Finish.
Right? So we got to contextualize the Safe Spaces program in the specific context in which it works. Now, if I wasn't Khaled Beydoun, I was just, let's just say my name is Ali Shawarma. I'm a civil rights attorney down the block. Right? And shawarma's good. Chicken shawarma especially. So if somebody came to me and they told me, hey, our kid, this Muslim kid down the block who's emotionally unstable, is going on the internet and going on websites that he shouldn't be visiting, and he wants to go talk to this organization which has set up the Safe Spaces program. What do you think? And I know a little something about the Muslim community, and I know a little bit about counter-radicalization programming. The first thing that's going to come to mind, and the first thing that should come to mind to any well-credentialed attorney is, when can you pierce that client-attorney privilege? What are the specific circumstances in which that privilege of confidentiality can be set aside? Issues of national security, right? So we can pass on that information, especially when an organization like MPAC has a close working relationship. Or let's not say it's close. Let's say it's an amicable working relationship with LAPD, which is conducting hardline CVE policing programming. That information can be passed on to the FBI agent. And let's say the information on its face is benign in nature. We know that LAPD and FBI agents have a specific incentive and a mandate to prosecute a specific number of individuals, and that's happened in the Twin Cities. How many false prosecutions have been advanced on innocent young Somali Muslim men in spaces like that that information that's collected by well-intentioned mental health therapists and well-intentioned organizations that want to do this work.
Can I just explain what he's referring to, piercing the veil, is that national security laws allow, as currently stated, they allow the government to basically not give you a choice
Exactly.
in accessing the information, although you do not want to provide that
But
information.
doesn't that apply to a counselor, a therapist, whether that therapist is involved in a private practice or
As
anything
far as
else?
I know, it does.
Okay, so
It applies across the
it
board.
applies everywhere. I mean,
No, it doesn't
it's-
apply everywhere. It applies specifically to information that can be connected to national
I
security.
know, I'm saying national security can be used anytime, any place is my point. So even if the therapist has a private practice and is counseling somebody, and if the government says it's a national security issue, we're in the same dilemma. My point is that we could go through a analysis of all these issues, but there's also paralysis by analysis, that we end up doing nothing. I feel like doing nothing is not an option. I think we should be providing ideas and correct them as we get critiqued, which is exactly how Safe Spaces was produced. It was a certain iteration that had a lot of flaws, and we got good feedback from the community, and we corrected it. Still had flaws, and now you see what it is today, and I think it's a great program. But at the end of the day, we can't just say that we're going to do nothing because we're against all these policies. Number two, when you say that we have a close relationship with DHS, again, I think that's a bit misleading. We are a trusted partner in terms of letting them know that we are there to advocate for the community. We are not these guys that just go in and say, hey, what contract can we get today? What job can, I'd be doing something else if all I was concerned about was getting contracts, okay? This job is not very redeeming for getting that. But what we do, that you don't, you either continue to ignore, or this is all part of your own narrative. What we do is we push back against those policies. So engagement does not mean endorsement. For MPAC, it's usually the opposite. We engage to push back on the policies that are detrimental to our community. So we have, for example, I'll give you an example. We have pushed back aggressively on this idea of radicalization theory, because we told the government that amounts to profiling. So, and that department eliminated the program after that. So that's what we do. And if I were a Muslim community member, yeah, I would ask questions from MPAC, what do you do in those meetings? And I'll answer them. But when we do answer them, the community says, we need somebody like that at the table. If you're not at the table, then somebody else who doesn't look for our interest is going to be at the table. And as Keith Ellison says, if you're not at the table, you'll be the menu of the table. So we have to engage at some point. Protest is fine, but there's the next level of, okay, well, what do you do in all these situations? Are we going to take questions? Because I have
I mean, do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, when he says radicalization has been eliminated, that component of the program.
that from that department.
Which department?
No, but he's giving a specific. But I think the larger issue, Khaled, is this issue of if you're not at the table. I mean, it's what I started with.
I think it's how you get to the table and which table you're at. There isn't only one table. And this falsehood that you're either doing something or making the wrong choice is not the paradigm and not the real paradigm. A range of individuals are doing things beyond the context of DHS and the War on Terror project and economy, right? So I think we have to be part of the process, right? We have to be. I condone individuals who try to work within power, but it's within that specific locus of power we have to, I think, steer away from, which is, endorsing and making decisions that make it easy for the state to carry forward the War on Terror project, including counter-radicalization. And I think that, again, he's going to disagree and say that he hasn't taken CVE funding, he hasn't taken CVE money, but it's well documented that he applied. He didn't disavow, the organization didn't disavow the funding. Trump, effectively cut the umbilical cord. And there's also evidence saying that beyond just funds, right? There's
Why
projects.
are you singling out MPAC? I don't understand.
I'm not. And again,
You
if you read, hey man, give me your email after this. I'll send you 4 or 5 articles.
Salam at MPAC.org.
I'm gonna send you 4 or 5 articles tonight.
Send it.
That
I want
list
to
the
see
whole.
you. I want to see you critique every organization
And I will.
that did.
When you name specific organizations like Care Florida, right? It was just revealed 2 months ago that Care Florida applied for those funds. So there's like a timing issue. And I wrote, look, man,
because we're transparent. That's the difference.
But when you write a book, and I'm going to plug this book, American Islamophobia: Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, right? It takes time. So I started writing this
as long as you retract the falsehood.
I started writing this a year ago, and that was a year before organizations like Care Florida were revealed. So I mean, so
you're just rationalizing.
No,
why you're singling out.
You want me to go back in time and write the book and include them? I will. I mean, I'll holler at somebody who has a time machine.
We're not gonna. I don't want to add anything that contributes to destructiveness. And so let's leave that as it is, because both of you have eloquently stated your positions, and let's take questions. And in questions, each of you can present.
Yeah, and I really do have to leave in about 10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
It'll be 2 hours. I have another
Okay.
commitment.
So thank you. So I have actually some questions that people have submitted, so we'll try to, some more. Well, let's just start. I mean, don't we need more than one approach to resolving the issues of Islamophobia? I'm going to combine a couple of these. I envision Salam as Dr. King and Khaled as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, the Eminem brothers. Malcolm X told Mrs. King that he didn't enjoy giving Dr. King a hard time, but maybe his radicalization would make the outer culture find Dr. King's message for full inclusion more palatable than outright revolution. Another one, it seems there is less disagreement between you both than different
This
meanings.
one, read it at the end again, because it's very interesting.
Okay. Malcolm X told Mrs. King that he didn't enjoy giving Dr. King a hard time, but maybe his radicalism would make the outer culture find Dr. King's message for full inclusion more palatable than outright revolution.
Yeah, I
it sees you as Shabazz, and
And I think most other, a lot of other communities, if you will, and movements, they take both approaches. There is the group that is pushing back and protesting from the outside, and there's the group that's on the inside pushing back and trying to create change within that engagement. And if I can quote Malcolm X, I think one of the most profound quotes that I have found says, "The problem facing our people is bigger than all other personal or organizational differences. Therefore, as leaders, we must stop worrying about the threat that we seem to think we pose to each other's personal prestige and concentrate our united efforts towards solving the unending hurt that is being done daily to our people here in America." So Malcolm X is talking about the need to band together. Exactly what the Quran is saying.
do you want to? Are there other questions you want to add? Or?
Well, because in the same spirit, I mean, it seems there's less disagreement between you both than different mediums will have us believe, although there is, albeit a vehement and legitimate disagreement. Do you think, however, that this disagreement could be less pronounced if there were more communication and collaboration between you both?
Yes,
the point about
my answer is yes. I'm open to it, and if Mr. Beydoun wants to come by the MPAC office and talk further and see exactly what we're doing, and he will see that of all the things that people talk about, CVE is one of the least priorities in the office. It's a controversy. It's a lot is talked about it, but he'll see that, and I hope he's open to coming to the office and seeing what MPAC has been doing in a number of fronts, from developing young leaders, giving them opportunities, fighting for civil rights, the Hollywood Bureau, and a number of programs that talk about the intersection between civil rights.
That of course doesn't take away, visiting their office doesn't take away your right to, after the visit, if you continue to not like what you see, vehemently disagree, to retain the same critical voice. I mean, it's...
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. If you know me, I mean, I'm not going to be silenced by gift or whatever it is. Look,
No, it's not. It's
not a gift.
It's
no,
not
or
a gift.
no,
It's
and
just,
I was
an
There you go again.
no, I'm not. That's not what I meant by that. And I welcome the gesture, and I'm glad to speak to MPAC in any capacity. That's why I decided to do.
Well, you were
Today's
here for a
debate.
number of years. I mean, did you?
Yeah.
Did you?
Oh, yeah,
Did you get to know the organization from
I
the
did,
inside?
of course, not from the inside, but I know a number of individuals who work for the organization. And again, I'm a scholar. Like, I read the literature that's out there, and I make assessments based on, my reading and research. Again, MPAC does some good work in other areas. I'm only focusing in on the major quandary that's related to counter-radicalization. And Salam says that's only one minor issue in a range of others. Some individuals here laughed when he said that, but it isn't to communities like my own, right? Counter-radicalization has a destructive impact
Nobody
on
laughed.
communities. No, she kind of chuckled when you said that. I caught on that. I caught on to that.
She works
That's
for
not the
Impact
center of our programming.
because she
Well,
knows.
again, when you minimize the importance of
I mean, right now our big issue is
when
immigration.
you
It's immigration.
when you minimize the importance of CVE to your portfolio, it might not be major to your portfolio in the range of work that you do, but again, it has a direct and major impact on specific communities. That's why people get so worked up about your position on CVE.
Khaled, there's like 20 entities that are working on CVE.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't understand why
But again, the
you have to
research,
single out
I'm
MPAC.
not
They
saying
are working on CVE. Do we engage them? Yes. Do I explain to them exactly what I explained here? We are here to empower communities to take matters into their own hands. That's what I tell them. And I'll tell you, exactly that. So, people don't like it, that's fine, but that's what we do.
But I mean, what I get from the questions are people are wondering if your positions are mutually exclusive. I mean,
I think so. Yeah, I mean they're mutually
And-
exclusive,
and-
but
and-
I don't think they are. I think the idea of civil rights and engagement, they need to figure out a way to work together.
But
That's
why
my...
do you think they're mutually exclusive?
they're mutually exclusive on the front of positions that endorse war on terror programming. Again, they align in other areas.
Again,
when you're talking, you're cutting me off.
sorry, I
Let
just
me
say
continue.
I don't agree that
Well, if
we
you listen,
are.
I'll tell you. If you listen right now,
we're
what I'm
promoting
saying,
the
I'll
war
tell
on
you why.
terror. We're not. Even if MPAC didn't exist, there would still
If
be.
you
the war
listen
on terror.
closely, what I'm getting ready to say, I'll resolve
Why
your
didn't
questions.
Kamal come today?
He's watching.
Okay.
Well, maybe he should have moderated this.
No, you've done a great. You've done a
You're doing
great
a good job.
Really, thank you. Go ahead.
You're going to disagree, but again, I think from my position, and it's not a unique position that I hold. A number of individuals in the community, and I'm not talking about the activists or the specific individuals that are calling you sellouts and so on. I'm talking about reputable individuals who study counter-radicalization, are highly critical of the position MPAC has taken for the reasons I've stated today.
So
Okay,
So have them call me and state specifically what they disagree with, and let's have a conversation.
And
Maybe it could be resolved by, maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe it's something that we said that was wrong, I don't know.
Mhm.
But I need to know what they're saying. I can't just keep hearing it behind my back every time somebody comes up, oh, it's CVE.
So this is a progressive step today that we had this conversation.
Yeah,
Inshallah, it leads to further programming where
Sure.
we can talk about.
Talk in the open. Bring it out in the open.
And I have. I've talked about some of the missteps today.
No, together.
Okay.
Let's talk about it in the
Yeah,
open.
and I'm happy to do that, and we can have a conversation to talk about the missteps. Second,
You're misconstruing it again. Your idea of missteps, but anyway.
my assessment as missteps, if you
And my
classify them
assessment
otherwise,
as effective engagement. But anyway, go ahead.
You're not gonna.
Yeah, we're not going to resolve that today,
Okay, we're not gonna
but
resolve that
let's at
today.
least have a discussion about it.
okay. Second, I agree. I think organizations should work together in areas in which there's alignment. I think MPAC has done good work in other areas. Again, if you read the book and if you read my other literature, I've never categorically vilified MPAC as being this sellout organization. I do say that there are elements of the organization which, again, perform this role of the native informant. Again, it's an academic position, right, that stances you have taken have allowed the war on terror, the broad industrial war on terror project to take place and have facilitated programs like counter-radicalization forward.
No.
Now, instead of you saying, instead of
I don't know how we promoted it.
I'm gonna break it down in very lay terms.
But
instead of
anyway.
you shaking your head and saying no, the biggest revelation from today for those of you watching at home, this man said he doesn't have a clear definition of countering
Just gave you
violent
what the government
extremism. Let me finish, man.
Okay.
Countering violent extremism. I know what it is. Other scholars know what it is. So since you don't know what it is and have still advanced to apply for the programming for the funding, for the programming, and so on, the next step should be consult with people who know what it is to help you navigate how to
stop
carry
putting
forward.
words in my mouth. I told you
You
what
said
the
that
definition-
verbatim.
I said there are 20 different definitions of it. I'm not
But
here to debate CVE.
the state
I'm not here to
operates.
debate
The
CVE.
state operates using one very clear and cogent definition.
And I'm against it.
But you still applied for the funding and carry forward.
So did 100 other Muslim
I know,
organizations
but we're not
who are
talking about other.
opposed to
You know, when
government-led
those
CVE.
organizations want to invite me to have a debate and talk about this issue, I'm glad to do that. But I'm talking to you, who's the head of Impact today.
Okay, I'm
Okay,
saying.
so I'm talking about
You
your
are
organization.
singling out Impact.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you keep doing
Again,
it.
read my work. Second,
All right, show it to me then.
I'm gonna email you tonight, man.
Yeah.
Second, if you want to have these conversations where we can address these differences, we got to do it candidly and objectively. I have no issue with impact, but I do have issue with the positions. Talk to the experts, consult with the individuals in the know that can help you steer your organization forward where you're not going to have these critics in the community anymore. People actually want to laud and collect and support organizations like your own when they take good decisions. Now, a point you made earlier, which is a really critical one, is that you held that impact, one of impact's fundamental missions is to be the voice for the constituents, right? For Muslims on the ground. The vast majority of Muslims on the ground oppose CVE, oppose counter-radicalization, oppose the kind of program that you've carried forward. Now, if that is your objective to support, to represent and be the voice for Muslims on the ground, then listen to them.
And we are
Listen to what
against
they're
government, and we are against government-led CVE. I don't know how many times I have to say this.
Okay.
Because you just don't want to hear it, or you don't want to accept it. We are against government-led CVE. So,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know what else to tell you.
The evidence says
Because
otherwise.
you keep misconstruing, and you keep misleading, you keep putting out false
The evidence says
information
otherwise.
about impact, and you keep singling out impact.
Would
However,
let me ask you this.
I am open.
Would you have kept the resources if Trump didn't disavow or disconnect them? Because you didn't disavow them before he did. On that phone call that day, you said that we are not going to denounce or disavow the funds.
As I
So you
said,
would have kept the funds, right?
No, but that's
So why
not,
didn't you
that's
disavow?
not the,
Why didn't you disavow them on that day?
As I told you before, our legal counsel said to preserve our legal standing, we cannot reject the funds. So you
Would
just
you have kept-
disclosed
would you-
the strategy to our political opponents.
Would you have
by
kept
the
the funds if
So
Hillary Clinton?
congratulations.
Would you have kept the funds if Hillary Clinton would have won the presidency?
If it was for just safe spaces, yes.
But were
For safe spaces.
were funds specifically designated for you to conduct the $450,000? I think it was.
If it were for safe spaces, yes.
Okay.
Did you see my? By the way, did you see my comments in front of Mrs. Clinton?
No.
Okay, well then you should. I'll send it to you. Listen to that, and then tell me if you still think that I am, promoting the war on terror. So.
Okay,
But I think we're going in circles
Yeah,
now.
I want to
because
close on,
Yeah, we're going in
on
circles.
I want to close on a positive note. So I want each of you to step in the other person's shoes. But what are the three things that you value about the other person's role? And moving forward from this conversation.
Please too much.
Five then. We're a religion of one. God.
Let's keep it tawheed.
Yeah,
One
keep the
thing.
tawheed on the. Yes.
What is the most valuable role?
I mean, I think,
that-
Khaled
and
Beydoun
let
is
me- let me
definitely.
finish,
I'm sorry.
and then
Go ahead.
also, moving forward from this conversation, what are you willing to do? What can you do? How do you see yourselves working together to promote sort of an elevation of our cause as Muslims together, and in the, in the spirit of what Malcolm X.
I mean, Khaled Beydoun is an expert on theory of national security policies and critical race theory, so I do respect him. I feel that when it comes to reality, that there's something else. Yeah, something else going on, but I think you're really good in terms of the research on the theory. And I open my office, or we can meet in your office. I don't want to go and speak at your office, and I don't expect you to come and speak in my office, but I want to have a meeting to just work on developing a better mutual understanding. Because at the end of the day, if you are writing books, and I'm developing programs for the Muslim community, the community needs to see us work together. Otherwise, they will get more demoralized and more disenchanted. And really, then you'll do your work, and Khaled will do his work, and I'll do my work, but it will be fractured.
I think that Salam and MPAC is an optimistic organization, right? And I think optimistic in the sense that it sees good, perhaps in what the government is doing, but perhaps that optimism, I think, eclipses the real negative dimensions of what the government is doing. So maybe I wish I had more of that optimism.
Okay, can
The
I say
Trump
something in
government?
closing?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I mean, I understand both perspectives, and that's what's you know, I take the view of a historian, and one of the systematic things that, and again, intergenerationally, we have been locked into since the advent of colonialism, is that, you know, I started out by when we talk about power and we talk about power dynamics and negotiating with power, we're not really talking theory. We're talking life, because that's what we do every single day, regardless of how we describe it. And you know, we have been, the dilemma has always been the some that see working with hegemonic power as empowering it, especially when in order to be able to produce incremental, to achieve incremental benefits, you have to accept some of the terms of its discourse. So in the old days, for instance, they used to call natives that oppose colonialism zealots, and those who don't oppose colonialism as rational or reasonable. Of course, today we use extremists, or you know, jihadis or whatever, and part of the dilemma is that in order to achieve incremental benefits for community needs, is that you end up having to adopt the language and the terminology of hegemonic power. So, you know, whether we embrace the terms zealots, or we embrace the terms militants, or we embrace the terms jihadis, or we extremism, or even as Muslims, when we start denouncing Sharia or de-emphasizing the role of Sharia in our lives. But on the other hand, those who point out to this dynamic and say, you know, stop legitimating the hegemonic enterprise, the colonial enterprise, the risk is that communities suffer. And when defied, when opposed, when the linguistic practice of the colonizer is challenged, the colonizer becomes savage. So, practically speaking, for instance, we saw British colonialism gas people in Iraq. We saw mass executions by Napoleon after he declared that he has become a Muslim and he converted to Islam, and then those who refused to adopt his terminology about Islam, he put to death a very, and my point is this, is that we see the same dynamic, we are locked into it, but the biggest challenge is that ultimately, I agree with Khaled that Homeland Security has become quite sophisticated, like the British Foreign Office, like the Dutch colonialism, like French colonialism, and they become remarkably sophisticated. And one of the things that they do that happens is that there are these fissures, these divides created in the communities of the disempowered, minority groups or the colonized, and so in other words, they even build a level of animosity between the again the Arabi who rebelled against British colonialism in an armed rebellion, and the Zaghlul, Saad Zaghlul, who wanted to work with to achieve incremental improvements. And these fissures, unfortunately, and I'm talking history, the lessons of history, becomes part of a divide and conquer paradigm. And I think, I mean, and this is an appeal to both of you. I mean, there's a lot of, and especially in part, I emphasize, Khaled, that Salam does have very thick skin, but when it comes to other people like Layla and Heather, Laird, and so on, it hurts at a different level. I think it needs an extra step to prevent the process of divide and conquer, because I just see it as a repeat of history time and time and time again. I mean, it's as if I've read the same debate in the books of history. I could have exchanged Salam for another historical figure and exchanged you for another historical figure, and then it would be the same dynamic. I don't know if you guys would do that, but I really hope you would, because I think the Muslim community needs it. It needs a Khaled Beydoun and it needs a al-Marayati, and I don't think the Muslim community can afford to lose either. That is without
Thank you very much.
I want to personally thank you. This was a really difficult conversation, I recognize. It took a lot of bravery, and you are amazing, all of you. And thank you for starting this conversation. I hope that this will lead to amazing things for all of us. So I'm very grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, we're very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both of you from your respective perspectives did an amazing job. I mean,
No, it's a difficult topic, you're right. And I think, part of it is the growing pains. These are growing pains of the community. We're dealing with so many issues.
there are triggers. Both of you use triggers, because there's nothing. You want to trigger an academic, say you have nothing to do with real life. You're just theory. That's a trigger for an academic. You know. On the other hand, you want to trigger an activist. Basically imply that they don't represent the community and that they're in for the little perks of power. And I think there is a moral obligation to overcome these triggers, because
Should have said that at the beginning.